Good afternoon. My name is Jose Feliciano. I know exactly what you're thinking. You're right, I'm much better looking than the singer. I'm a partner at Baker & Hostetler and a founder and chairman of the Hispanic Roundtable, and proud to say, Dan, I'm also a long-standing member of the City Club. I'm honored today to introduce Congressman Pedro Pierluisi, resident commissioner to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Es mi placer. In 1917, all residents of Puerto Rico were made citizens of the United States. However, U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico have no representation in the Congress. They cannot vote for president, yet each party has a primary election there. This relationship is complicated, to say the least. The Commonwealth has its own tax laws, but still pays U.S. federal taxes. They pay into Social Security, but cannot take advantage of supplemental Social Security income. There is Medicaid, but they receive significantly less support than the 50 other states. There's a federal district court in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rican laws can be declared unconstitutional. This complexity is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Puerto Rico. There have been many attempts by Puerto Rico to achieve statehood over the years. Most recently, the cause has been taken up by the resident commissioner, Pierluisi. Making Puerto Rico the 51st state would grant residents of the island full voting rights at the federal level. In November 2012, in a referendum, the majority of los Puerto Ricanos cast a vote for statehood. Several days after the referendum, Congressman Pierluisi wrote a letter to President Obama urging him to begin legislation in favor of statehood. President Obama, interestingly, received two other letters following this election, one from Governor Luis Fortuno and one from then Governor-elect Alejandro Garcia Padilla. Fortuno agreed with Pierluisi and even urged the president to expedite the process. And Governor-elect Alejandro Garcia Padilla, however, asked him to reject the results because of the number of voters that abstained from voting on this specific issue. There is much complexity on this subject, even within Puerto Rico itself. The debate continues. Allow me a brief digression here. Some of you know the old joke about how people from different groups respond to a question about the same subject. For instance, an elephant. Several people are shown an elephant and asked to write something about it. The Frenchman writes, "The Love Life of an Elephant." The German writes a paper entitled, "The Preliminary Investigation into the Metaphysical Implications of the Elephant." The Midwesterner American writes a report on the practical aspects of elephant training and management. The Puerto Rican, of course, writes an article entitled "The Elephant and Whether Puerto Rico Should Become a State." In August, several congressmen asked Puerto Rico's Governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla, who opposes statehood, to make a decision whether there should be statehood or independence. And this came in response to President Obama's request for a $2.5 million referendum to be held on statehood. Governor Padilla argues that the current status allows for an advantageous tax status for residents. He favors an enhanced Commonwealth that would provide the island with maximum autonomy and secure relationship with the United States. Now, I'm going to let Congressman Pierluisi give his reasons for encouraging statehood. Pedro Pierluisi has been a resident commissioner of Puerto Rico since 2009. He is a graduate of Tulane University and George Washington University Law School, attended by Judge Villanueva himself. Born in San Juan, Pierluisi served as Puerto Rico's Attorney General for 10 years before successfully running for resident commissioner. Bueno, Pedro, de parte de este jíbaro de Yauco y el pueblo de Cleveland, bienvenido, un abrazo fuerte. Let me give you the commissioner.
Gracias. Gracias. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I want to thank Jose Feliciano, the chairman of the Hispanic Roundtable, for that warm introduction. I also want to thank Kent State University, where I delivered a speech in April of this year, for helping to arrange my appearance here today. Finally, I want to thank the City Club of Cleveland and its Chief Executive Director, Dan Moulthrop, for graciously inviting me to speak. I'm thrilled to be here. For over a century, the City Club of Cleveland has hosted prominent speakers, including presidents, senators, secretaries of state, and Supreme Court justices, to discuss issues of national and global importance. And I feel honored and humbled to have been invited. I want to welcome our audience, including those watching on television and online or listening on the radio. Since 2009, I have served as the representative in Congress for the 3.6 million American citizens of Puerto Rico, a position known as the resident commissioner. I know that Congress is not very popular right now, given that its actions have led to a shutdown of most federal government operations. And so, I hope you will be gentle with me. The subject of my remarks is Puerto Rico's political status, and in particular, the prospect of the U.S. territory becoming a U.S. state, which is a goal I have been fighting for since I was a student, no older than many of the young men and women in this room. Following my remarks, I look forward to answering any questions you may have. I urge you to challenge my arguments on the merits, because I welcome vigorous debate. I want to begin by expressing this sentiment. In one sense, Puerto Rico's political status is a complicated subject, lying at the intersection of history, law, politics, identity, and culture. In another sense, however, this matter at its heart has always struck me as simple and straightforward. For reasons I will attempt to explain, it is about right versus wrong, equality versus inequality, and justice versus injustice. My goal is to distill the subject down to its essence, to strip away the layers of complexity in the hope that you too will see the crystal clear core. My remarks will cover three areas. First, I will explain Puerto Rico's current political status and describe some of the practical consequences of this status. When I talk to my congressional colleagues or travel around the country meeting people, I find that there is a significant degree of confusion about Puerto Rico and its relationship to the United States. This knowledge gap does not irritate or offend me, because it is almost never rooted in indifference or ill will. I do believe that U.S. schools and media outlets could do more to educate the public on this subject. But in my experience, Americans of all political stripes are genuinely curious about Puerto Rico, and once they are introduced to the topic, they're eager to learn more. Second, I will summarize the reasons why I believe that statehood would be in the best interest of both Puerto Rico and the United States as a whole. I recognize and respect that there are people of good faith who do not share this view. Some, for instance, would prefer to see the territory become a sovereign country where future generations would be citizens of Puerto Rico, not citizens of the United States. Nationhood is a dignified and democratic status, but it has very little popular support in Puerto Rico because most of my constituents do not believe that it would lead to a better quality of life for them and their families. Lastly, I will describe the historic results of a referendum that Puerto Rico held last November, where a clear majority of voters said they do not want Puerto Rico to continue its current status, and more voters expressed a desire for statehood than for any other status option. I will explain the steps I am taking in Washington to ensure that the federal government responds to this expression of the democratic will. For Puerto Rico's status to change, whether to become a state or a sovereign nation, it is not enough for the people of Puerto Rico to demand change. Rather, Congress must approve and the President must sign legislation to bring this change into effect. That is why it is so important for this subject to be debated not only in Puerto Rico, but in the states as well, because it is an issue that affects our entire country. Before we examine Puerto Rico's future, however, we need to understand where the island stands at present. And to do that, it helps to know a little about our past. There is a provision in the U.S. Constitution known as the Territory Clause that gives Congress broad power to legislate regarding the territories. For a century or so, following ratification of the Constitution, it was assumed that an area's designation as a territory was temporary and would ultimately lead to that territory becoming a state. During this period, many jurisdictions evolved from territories to states. Ohio was one of those states. In 1898, as part of the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired Puerto Rico as well as the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba from Spain. There was a spirited, though not always high-minded, debate in this country about how the U.S. should treat its new territories, which were located far away and whose residents were regarded as different in racial, cultural, linguistic, and other respects. In 1900, the federal government enacted a law that established a civilian government in Puerto Rico, led by a governor appointed by the president. Two legislative chambers were established, an unelected upper chamber and an elected lower chamber. The law also authorized the election of a representative to the federal government, the resident commissioner, who was later given a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. I am the 19th person to hold this office, and it has been the greatest honor of my professional life. In the first decades of the 20th century, the Supreme Court decided a series of cases regarding its island territories, holding that Puerto Rico had been acquired by the United States but had not been incorporated as part of the U.S. In short, the court created a black and white world of incorporated and unincorporated territories. Under this doctrine, an incorporated territory was one on the path to statehood in the long-standing American tradition, while an unincorporated territory was one whose ultimate status, statehood or nationhood, Congress had yet to decide. Some critics of these cases took comfort in their assumption that Puerto Rico's status as an unincorporated territory would be temporary, lasting only until the federal government either granted American citizenship to island residents, which would presumably place Puerto Rico on the path to statehood, or granted the island its independence. It was not long before this theory was put to the test. In 1917, on the eve of the U.S. entry into World War I, a federal law was enacted to extend citizenship to individuals born in Puerto Rico. However, in a controversial decision handed down 5 years later, the Supreme Court held that the grant of citizenship did not demonstrate that Congress intended to incorporate Puerto Rico. Thus, the court held that Puerto Rico's status as an unincorporated territory could last indefinitely. Accordingly, unless the Supreme Court revisits its earlier cases, any solution to Puerto Rico's status dilemma must come from Congress and the White House rather than the judiciary. In the 1940s and 1950s, the federal government took additional steps to grant the government of Puerto Rico increased authority over local matters. In 1947, the law was amended to provide for the territory's governor to be popularly elected. And in 1950, the federal government authorized the territory to draft a local constitution, which took effect in 1952 after Congress required certain changes. All told, Congress has now delegated to Puerto Rico about the same degree of authority over local matters that the states possess under the Constitution. Nevertheless, and this is a critical point, these measures have not altered Puerto Rico's status as an unincorporated territory subject to Congress's broad powers under the Territory Clause. This may surprise some of you who have heard Puerto Rico described as a commonwealth and therefore assumed that Puerto Rico must have some special status that is neither a state nor a territory. But this is simply not the case. The term Commonwealth does not denote any particular status, as demonstrated by the fact that 4 U.S. states also call themselves Commonwealths. When people ask what Puerto Rico's status is, the only correct answer is that Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. So, what are the practical implications of territory status? I would place them in 3 baskets. One labeled political rights, one stamped civil rights, and one branded economic opportunities. In reality, there is a meaningful degree of overlap and interplay between these baskets, but this serves as a useful conceptual framework. With respect to political rights, federal law is supreme in Puerto Rico, just like it is in Ohio or any state. However, because Puerto Rico is a territory, the U.S. citizens who reside on the island cannot choose the leaders who make their national laws. They cannot vote for their president and commander-in-chief, even though they serve in large numbers in all branches of the U.S. military. They are not represented in the U.S. Senate, a body where each member wields tremendous power. And they send only one representative to the U.S. House, the resident commissioner. In this role, I can introduce bills and vote on committees, but I cannot vote on the House floor. While 435 of my colleagues from Maine to Alaska cast votes on bills that affect my constituents, I am confined to the role of a spectator. My purpose here is to generate reflection, not outrage, on your part. Pause for a moment to contemplate the intensity with which women of an earlier generation fought, or the sacrifices that African Americans endured to achieve the right to vote, to obtain a real voice in choosing the leaders who make the policies that shape their lives. More recently, and far away from our shores, consider the Arab Spring, where courageous men and women from Tunisia to Syria have sought with varying levels of success to depose dictators and usher in more democratic systems of government. Against this backdrop, it is difficult to understand how residents of Puerto Rico, citizens of the greatest democracy in history, still do not enjoy true self-government after 115 years under the American flag. It is the 21st century, after all. With respect to the basket labeled civil rights, the Supreme Court has held that, with limited exceptions, the federal government can enact laws that treat territories differently than the states. And it should come as no surprise that the federal government has done so with considerable frequency. Residents of Puerto Rico are treated worse than their fellow citizens in the states under critical federal programs, including the Maine Poverty Relief Program, the major health insurance programs for the poor and the elderly, the Primary Nutrition Assistance Program, the program to assist low-income individuals who are elderly, blind, or disabled, and the landmark Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, that is in the process of coming into full effect. Some of you may have heard it argued that residents of Puerto Rico do not pay federal taxes and therefore should receive fewer federal funds than their counterparts in the states. This argument deserves careful scrutiny because the truth is more complex. Congress has chosen to exempt most residents of Puerto Rico from paying federal taxes on income they earn in the territory. However, island residents are required to pay federal taxes on any income they earn in the States or in foreign countries. Workers in Puerto Rico are also responsible for all federal payroll all federal payroll taxes, which are deducted from their paychecks. Furthermore, nearly half of all U.S. households in the States do not earn enough to pay federal income taxes, and yet they're treated equally under all federal safety net programs. Finally, the reality is that federal law, through the use of refundable tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, actually provides a substantial benefit to working families in the States that is denied to working families in Puerto Rico. To illustrate, consider a married couple with 2 children living in Ohio that earns $25,000 a year, and then consider an identical family living in Puerto Rico. Both families owe the same payroll taxes, but the Ohio family would receive over $6,000 in federal tax credits for a final income of over $30,000. The Puerto Rico family, because it is ineligible for these credits, takes home less than $24,000. This is a useful example to bear in mind when you hear someone cite the supposed tax advantages of living in Puerto Rico as a justification for treating residents of the territory unequally under federal programs. Now, let me turn to the third basket of consequences, the one labeled economic opportunities. Because Puerto Rico is treated unequally under numerous federal grant and tax credit programs, it is deprived of billions of dollars every year that would otherwise flow to the local economy. The shortfall in federal funds has 3 interlocking effects in Puerto Rico. First, individuals who have less money to spend on goods and services, businesses make fewer sales, and economic growth is hindered. Second, the quality of government services delivered in a range of areas, including health care and aid to the most vulnerable, is relatively inferior, often shockingly so. Third, the responsibility for providing many of these services is shifted from the federal government to the Puerto Rico government, which is compelled to shoulder a disproportionate share of the financial burden. This has a negative cascading effect, characterized by excess government borrowing, large deficits and debt, higher interest payments, credit downgrades, and the diminished ability to make other important investments for the benefit of the public. To demonstrate that Puerto Rico's economic problems are structural and chronic rather than cyclical and temporary, let me offer 3 quick examples. Since at least the 1970s, when the federal government began collecting statistics, Puerto Rico's unemployment rate has always been far higher than every state. The island's unemployment rate has averaged 15.5%, while the U.S. national unemployment rate has averaged under 6.5%, a 9-point difference. Next, consider the employment to population ratio, which measures the share of a jurisdiction's working age population that is employed. Over the last 35 years, the ratio in the U.S. has averaged over 60%. The ratio among Hispanics living in the U.S. is currently about 60% as well. In Puerto Rico, the ratio ranges from 30 to 40%. Finally, consider household income. Between 2007 and 2012, the median household income in the United States was about $52,000. The median household income in Mississippi was around $40,000. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, it's under $20,000. To be sure, some of Puerto Rico's economic problems are attributable to local mismanagement, and their severity could be alleviated by more responsible and capable leadership in San Juan. But on those occasions when I hear policymakers and commentators in Washington shake their heads at Puerto Rico's long underperforming economy, I am tempted to compare the situation to depriving a man of essential food and then professing to be surprised that he's too sickly to work productively. The best evidence that the architecture of Puerto Rico's economy is unsound is also the most discouraging. In addition to a falling birth rate, the territory is experiencing a mass exodus of its population to the states, including to Ohio. As American citizens, my constituents do not need a passport to begin a new life in Florida or Texas. The only thing they require is money for a one-way plane ticket. In 2004, there were over 3.8 million people living in Puerto Rico. Today, there are about 3.6 million. The territory's population, in other words, has declined by over 4% in that brief period of time. Meanwhile, the Puerto Rican population in the States has skyrocketed from 3.4 million in 2000 to nearly 5 million today, a 45% increase. The irony, of course, is that as soon as any constituents of mine from Caguas or Coamo move to Cleveland or Chicago, they instantly acquire the right to vote for their national leaders and the right to equal treatment under the law. Rights that were denied to them while living in Puerto Rico. The lesson that I draw from all of these economic and demographic statistics is that Puerto Rico, because of the limitation inherent in territory status, has not been able to provide its people with the quality of life they deserve, and that it is time for this status to be discarded in favor of a different status. The world is evolving rapidly, both economically and politically, and yet Puerto Rico remains stuck in neutral, and recently even seems to be moving in reverse. The path we are on has led us to a dead end. We need a new path, a new destination. Let me explain briefly why I believe statehood is the right and logical destination for Puerto Rico, as the first President Bush phrased it. Other than the current status, Puerto Rico has three alternatives: statehood, full independence, and something called nationhood in free association with the United States. Independence and free association are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is nationhood. Both are dignified options that would provide Puerto Rico with full self-government at the national level. But we need to be very clear about what these status options could mean for quality of life on the island. Independence would break all of the strong economic, political, and social bonds that have formed between Puerto Rico and the United States over 115 years, a prospect the overwhelming majority of my constituents reject. Likewise, free association would substantially weaken the close ties that have been forged between Puerto Rico and the United States. Under free association, Puerto Rico would become a sovereign nation, but would have an agreement with the U.S. that sets forth the terms of the relationship between the two nations, and that could be terminated by either nation at any point. The U.S. currently has such agreements with three small nations in the Pacific: the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. These countries are included in certain federal programs, but do not receive assistance under important programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Residents of these nations can enter and work in the U.S. freely, but unlike residents of Puerto Rico, they are not American citizens. While independence would dissolve our union with the United States and free association would weaken our union, statehood would perfect our union. Statehood would deliver to Puerto Rico what all free people deserve: full voting rights, full self-government, and full equality under the law. the state of Puerto Rico would have far more political power than the territory of Puerto Rico. As a state, Puerto Rico would have 2 U.S. senators, 5 representatives in the U.S. House, and 7 votes for president and vice president in the Electoral College. At the same time, in part by ensuring that Puerto Rico would receive equal treatment under all federal programs, statehood would strengthen Puerto Rico's economy and improve our quality of life, as the most recent examples of Alaska and Hawaii demonstrate. Indeed, I have never heard an objective observer argue otherwise. I want to address perhaps the most common argument against statehood, which is that Puerto Rico's vibrant culture would be compromised if the territory were to become a state. Those who make this argument do not understand or choose to ignore the composition and characteristics of the contemporary United States. There are now 53 million Hispanics in this country, constituting 17% of the national population. That percentage is projected to increase to 31% by 2060. Sometimes, when I hear the negative way in which certain statehood opponents describe the United States, they seem to be talking about the racially and ethnically divided country of 1898 or 1950, not the diverse and inclusive society that the U.S. has become today. More to the point, statehood will not change the fact that Puerto Rico is located in the Caribbean, 1,000 miles from Miami, and the fact that our culture draws upon the influence of Latin America, Africa, and Europe, as well as the United States. Evolving from an unequal member of the American family to an equal member of the American family will not change who we are as a people. Our history, traditions, language, faith, food, arts, music, love of family, and passion for life. These things are the essence of what it means to be Puerto Rican. Nothing, certainly not equality under statehood, could ever diminish their role in our lives. Up until now, I have suggested that the current status hurts and that statehood would help Puerto Rico. I want to add just a few words about why I think statehood would also be better for the United States. It is a mistake to assume that status is a zero-sum game, where one side's gain is another side's loss. In my view, statehood would be mutually beneficial for Puerto Rico and the United States. From a practical vantage point, the U.S. succeeds when Puerto Rico succeeds, when the island is strong, secure, and stable, when its residents do not feel obligated to relocate to the States to achieve their dreams, when they live, work, and invest in Puerto Rico, when the island's economy grows, individuals and businesses prosper, and the tax base both widens and deepens. From the U.S. perspective, a robust and resilient state of Puerto Rico would advance the national interest. From a purely political vantage point, I can say to both Republicans and Democrats that they should not view the prospective state of Puerto Rico as either a blessing or a curse for their party's future or fortunes. I firmly believe Puerto Rico would be a competitive state where each national party, if it is willing to put in the effort, could achieve success. The island's population appreciates an active government that empowers individuals and assists the needy, but it is socially conservative on a range of issues. So, electorally speaking, the state of Puerto Rico would be very much in play. From a moral vantage point, if Puerto Rico wants statehood, I cannot identify any principled basis upon which Congress could decline that petition. How could the United States government, a champion of democracy and self-determination around the world, disregard those principles with respect to its own citizens without losing credibility both at home and abroad? Given the contributions that residents of Puerto Rico have made to this country in times of both war and peace, it is not difficult to understand why President Reagan said that his administration would accept whatever status choice is made by a majority of the island's population, a sentiment that has been expressed in similar form by every president since Harry Truman. In a very real sense, Puerto Rico has earned the right to be equal. Turning to the final section of my speech, I want to discuss the recent developments on this issue, which are among the most significant in memory. Last November, pursuant to a local law, Puerto Rico held a two-question referendum on its political future. The results demonstrate that 54% of voters do not support the current territory status, that 61% favor statehood among the three alternative options, and that more voters want statehood than any other option, including the current status. This historic vote has received a great deal of attention in the national and international media. In June, I testified at a United Nations hearing on the matter. And in August, a Senate committee held a hearing on the referendum, and I appeared as a witness. At the hearing, the committee chairman, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, said, quote, "There is no disputing that a majority of the voters in Puerto Rico have clearly expressed their opposition to the continuing current territorial status," unquote. Chairman Wyden also made this powerful statement, quote, "For Puerto Rico to meet its economic and social challenges and to achieve its full potential, this debate over status needs to be settled. Puerto Rico must either exercise full self-government as a sovereign nation or achieve equality among the states of the Union. The current relationship undermines the United States' moral standing in the world. For a nation founded on the principles of democracy and the consent of the governed, how much longer can America allow a condition to persist in which nearly 4 million U.S. citizens do not have a vote in the government that makes the national laws which affect their daily lives? That is the question," end quote. My view is this. Now that American citizens living in an American territory have informed their national government in a free and fair vote that they do not consent to a political status that deprives them of the most democratic, basic and democratic rights, it is incumbent upon the federal government to take appropriate action in response. In April, with my support, the Obama administration requested an appropriation of $2.5 million, which would be provided to the Puerto Rico Elections Commission to conduct the first federally sponsored status vote in the territory's history, with the specific purpose of resolving the issue. This funding was approved by the Republican-controlled House Appropriations Committee. If Congress ultimately approves appropriations bills for the current fiscal year, which is an open question, I'm confident this language will become law. Moreover, in May, I introduced a bill called the Puerto Rico Status Resolution Act. My legislation outlines the rights and responsibilities of statehood, provides for an up or down vote in Puerto Rico on the territory's admission as a state, and lays out the steps the President and Congress would take if a majority of voters favor admission. Those supporting statehood and those opposing it would have equal opportunity to express their views. My bill already has 124 co-sponsors from all over the country, including 12 Republicans, which is a major achievement in these highly partisan times. In conclusion, I believe that the quest for Puerto Rico statehood is a fight for civil rights and human dignity. This nation's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, stand for the principle that all men are created equal and that there is no such thing as second-class citizenship in this country. This nation fought a war with itself to vindicate that principle. And later generations, among them women and African Americans, had to struggle and sacrifice to become full and equal members of the American family. Like these earlier movements, the Puerto Rico statehood movement is driven by the desire to perfect our union. With determination and faith, I am confident we will prevail. Thank you.
Coño, eso estaba bueno. I'm sitting down, I got a couple of remarks. Today at the City Club, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Congressman Pedro Pierluisi, Resident Commissioner for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. We will return momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speaker now and remind you that our questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via broadcast on WVIZ PBS 90.3, WCPN, and 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream. WTAM, one of our many broadcast partners across the country. The broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live broadcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, October 11th, the City Club welcomes Janet Marguilla, President of National Council of La Raza. On the evening of October the 16th, the City Club welcomes Thomas Felton, Director of the Cleveland Public Library, who will discuss the importance of enhancing the People's University. And Saturday, October 19th, as Dan told you, we welcome all of you to join us at Convención Hispana, a day-long free community assembly held this year at St. Ignatius High School. And we have our friends from the Hispanic Roundtable right here in front of us. This year's speaker is Mayor Julian Castro of San Antonio. And for more information about our upcoming forums, to make reservations or to order a CD or a DVD of one of our many programs, please refer to our website, www.cityclub.org. We welcome guests at tables hosted by my favorite law firm, Baker and Hostetler, and Kent State University, where I was privileged to be the president's ambassador, appointed by Lester Lofton. This special shout out today, if we're welcoming people to David McAvinci here from Dublin, Ireland, who interestingly has crossed the Atlantic Ocean several times in his own boat. That's not how he got here today, but anyway, we thank our sponsors, Baker and Kent State. Today's program is sponsored by Northeast Ohio Media Group, the sponsors of Politics and Policy at the Cleveland City Club. We welcome students today. To today's program, students participating is made possible by a generous gift by Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. And today we welcome students from St. Martin de Porres, New Tech Academy, and Cleveland School of Medicine, Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. Will the student please stand and be recognized? Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club questions and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Program Director Kerry Miller. First question, please.
Congressman, you mentioned the admission of Hawaii and Alaska to the United States. At the time, it was widely considered that Hawaii would be Democratic and Alaska would be basically Republican, and that was facilitated the admission of those two territories. To what extent do you think the admission of Puerto Rico, for which you gave some very good reasons, were to be admitted to the United States? It would be helpful if at the same time there was a territory which would be admitted, which would be allegedly Republican.
Yeah, interesting. And it turns out that those predictions were wrong, because everybody expected back then in 1959 that Alaska would be a Democratic state and ended up being a Republican, pretty much a Republican state in terms of their congressional delegation, and the opposite happened in Hawaii. They were thinking it would be Republican and ended up being primarily Democratic. So those predictions tend to be it's more speculation than anything else. In the case of Puerto Rico, that's why you heard me say, don't read us like a Democratic state just because, for example, I am a Democrat, proudly so. And the members of Congress in the states who are from Puerto Rican origin most of them are Democrats as well. Don't read us that way. That's too simplistic. In Puerto Rico, you would probably have a mixed congressional delegation. Why? Because Puerto Rico is, on the one hand, socially conservative, on the other hand, is used to a government that helps the needy and that intervenes in the economy. And then the only other, not a territory, but right now you have DC, the District of Columbia, seeking voting rights in Congress, as well as statehood. And so some have said, why don't the two of you go together? Well, it wouldn't work. I support voting rights for the District of Columbia. I support even statehood for the District of Columbia, but it is a different case. And it wouldn't be right to view Puerto Rico as a Republican state either. So this combo, if you call it, let's do a combo here, District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, to me it makes no sense. Each one should make its case on its merits. And in the case of Puerto Rico, I am convinced, as you heard me say, that it is the way to go.
My name is Margie Colon, and I would like to say thank you for coming. I appreciate all the remarks you made, and you have also made us very knowledgeable from Puerto Rico. I had several questions, and you kind of answered like two of them, so I have one more question. My question is that if Puerto Rico becomes a 51st state, how long would this process take, and when will we be allowed, from Puerto Rico, when will we be allowed to vote, and would it be ready by 2016?
You are very proactive, not to say aggressive. Okay, statehood is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be a process. What I am seeking as Puerto Rico's representative in Congress is that Congress put Puerto Rico on a path to statehood. The first step would be to lay out statehood for the Puerto Rican voters. And then I am confident you'll get a majority vote for the admission of Puerto Rico as a state. And then there has to be legislation providing for the admission. In all likelihood, there will be a transition period because you need to gradually give Puerto Rico additional federal assistance, give Puerto Rico parity, equal treatment under federal programs, and gradually impose federal income taxes on the residents of Puerto Rico, including corporations doing business in Puerto Rico. And it should be a gradual process. How long would that last? It depends on the will of Congress. It could be 6 years, it could be 8 years, but keep that in mind. There will be a transition period, because if you put yourselves in the position of any member of Congress, you want to do this right. There is in the Constitution of the United States a clause called the Tax Uniformity Clause, which basically provides that all states should be treated equally in terms of taxes, okay? But when you're talking about a new state, okay, then you can make a difference. You can treat that new state differently for a period of time. Again, a transition period. So that's how I envision this happening. Another tidbit that your question didn't raise, but let me clarify here. Some in the states, including members of Congress, erroneously think that giving statehood to Puerto Rico means taking 5 members from other states, members of the House. It doesn't work like that. The Constitution of the United States allows Congress to increase the number of the members of the House. So if we are transitioning Puerto Rico to statehood, we can increase the number of the members of the House from 435 members, which is the number now, to 440. And then when you do a census, the same thing would happen, like it happened, always happens, which is that based on the census, then you would be splitting the 440 chairs or positions throughout the states, depending on population. So I clarified that too. So it'll be a process. It's not going to happen. You said 2016. Wow, that's ambitious. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. And I'm fighting for it. Hey, I just said it. I mean, I introduced that bill that I referred to, which provides for a process for Puerto Rico to become a state, just about 4 or 5 months ago. And already 124 members of Congress, including, to my recollection, 2 members from Ohio, are sponsoring it. Including as well 12 Republicans, which is not easy these days. So I'm working it, but wow, but you want me to accelerate the pace to the extreme.
Congressman, welcome. I have 2 questions. You talked about the funding, that if Congress approves the money, in the $2 million or $2.5 million for a vote, will that include Puerto Ricans who live here in the mainland? Are we allowed to vote on that? And my second question is, Barron's just published an article about Puerto Rico's debt, $58 billion, and that was a caution to investors. And is that something that's a hindrance to those elected representatives who have to vote and say, why should we incur, that island's debt of $58 billion? And what are you doing in Puerto Rico to address that debt?
The debt situation shouldn't be an issue, because when you become a state, it doesn't mean that Congress then assumes your debt. No, Puerto Rico, for purposes of our local government, as I said, is the same as any state. And so Puerto Rico needs to comply with its debt obligations. In fact, our Constitution says that we have to, and that we pay bondholders first, and then we take care of all other needs. Our own Constitution says that. So we're in the same boat as the states right now in terms of our debt. And if we become a state, it would be the same. That wouldn't change. In fact, as I see it, Puerto Rico has indebted itself, partially indebted itself, to compensate or make for the lack of federal funding we have. Because when you don't have equal treatment in housing programs, in health programs, in transportation programs, who do you think needs to make up for that? I mean, Puerto Rico itself and the local residents of Puerto Rico. So it's all related. I think that takes care of, what was the other?
Regarding Puerto Ricans in the mainland.
Okay, it's always an issue. When in 2009, I introduced a bill providing for a federally sponsored plebiscite in Puerto Rico. It was H.R. 2499. And that bill said that persons born in Puerto Rico, regardless of their place of residence, could be eligible to vote, and left the details of the process for allowing that vote to happen to the Puerto Rico Electoral Commission, to the Elections Commission. The bill that I just introduced is silent on that issue, simply says again that the Puerto Rico State Elections Commission should be the one providing for eligibility to vote, the eligibility requirements for voting. Typically in the United States, as you well know, you vote where you reside. That's our system. Foreign countries is different. When you're dealing with foreign countries, many foreign countries allow their nationals or residents or nationals or citizens to go to the consular offices of their countries in their cities or embassy in Washington and vote. Okay, but Puerto Rico doesn't have consular offices or embassies, so the logistics of this process would be complicated. The bill, as I say, it doesn't provide for it expressly, pretty much leaves it to the Electoral Commission, and I am the first one who admits that it's pretty complex to deal with it. Now, I know that diaspora, a lot of the Puerto Ricans living in the States have strong feelings on these issues. And I know that a lot of them also would like to express themselves on this issue. Others say the ones living in Puerto Rico should be the ones actually voting, because they're the ones suffering the consequences of the current status. When you're here, you might be attached, you might be, even visit Puerto Rico on a regular basis, but you're not exactly in the same boat as the ones down there. But again, it's a complicated issue, and we'll have to see how this develops. The president's bill that you're talking about, the $2.5 budget request that the president made doesn't get into that detail. Simply says it's for a federally sponsored vote in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico status to solve Puerto Rico status. So my position is that basically the president is saying, let's solve this. And we cannot solve it with the current status. When the people just rejected it, we have to solve it through either statehood or nationhood. And that's my basic position.
Very happy to see you back in Cleveland again.
Thank you.
Jose Lopez, Oscar Lopez, Oscar Lopez, Oscar Lopez. What is your office doing with that issue? 32 years in jail, the longest ever prisoner.
Yeah.
Even the Mandela, so.
No, I have joined my fellow Puerto Rican members of Congress, at least 3 of them, Jose Serrano, Nidia Velázquez, and Luis Gutierrez, in demanding, pleading, call it whatever, that Oscar Lopez Rivera be allowed to come back home. He's been in prison too long. He committed a crime. There was no violence involved that I can tell. And he supports independence for Puerto Rico. But he's been in jail too long. So we've said enough. The punishment is pretty much cruel and unusual by now. And I have written, I have spoken, along with my fellow members of Congress, and will continue to do it until he's freed. All the other ones who were accused for similar crimes tied to the fight for independence for Puerto Rico are free, are back home. None of them committed any other crimes. They've been law-abiding, and I believe the same would happen when Oscar Lopez Rivera is allowed to go back to San Sebastián del Pepino, and I hope that day arrives. The sooner, the better.
Today at the City Club, we've been listening to a Friday forum featuring Congressman Pedro Pierluisi, Resident Commissioner for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This program is now adjourned. That was great.